Aries, have you ever noticed this? The moment you stopped trying to be understood, someone quietly disappeared from your life. No argument, no goodbye, just distance. And here's the part that stays with you at night. You didn't feel wrong. You felt seen. And somehow, that scared them. Because Aries, you don't love halfway. You don't hide behind silence. When you show up fully. And not everyone knows what to do when the room suddenly fills with truth. So if you've been asking yourself, why did they run when nothing was broken? Stay with me. And before we go any further, tell me in the comments, have you felt this shift too? Trust yourself, because what you're about to hear was already unfolding long before they walked away. Aries, there's something subtle I want to sit with you on for a moment. When someone feels seen by you, truly seen, it doesn't land in their mind first. It lands in their body, in the tightening of the chest, in that quiet urge to step back without knowing why. You have a way of standing in a room that doesn't ask for permission, not loud, not demanding, just present. And that kind of presence doesn't negotiate with masks. What they felt wasn't judgment, it wasn't pressure, it was recognition. You mirrored back a version of them they hadn't made peace with yet. Not the polished one, not the one they show the world, but the part that still hesitates, the part that delays, the part that knows it could live more honestly, but hasn't. And here's the part people rarely talk about. For someone who has survived by staying emotionally flexible, by adapting, by blending in, your steadiness can feel like gravity, not because you pull them in aggressively, but because you don't move to make them comfortable. You don't shift your truth to soften the moment. You don't dilute what you feel to keep the peace. You stay. That's an Aries thing, not impulsive fire, anchored fire. And that's where the discomfort began. Because when you stay rooted, the other person has to decide whether they will rise to meet you or quietly exit the room. They didn't leave because you asked too much. You didn't even ask. They left because your presence asked a question they weren't ready to answer yet. Who am I when I'm not hiding? Who do I become if I stop delaying my own growth? Those questions don't announce themselves. They surface as restlessness, as distance, as a sudden urge to reclaim control by disappearing. If you replay those moments now, you might remember how nothing felt wrong on the surface. No conflict, no drama, just a shift you couldn't quite name. That's usually the moment someone realizes they've been living one layer above their truth. And standing next to you made that impossible to ignore. I want to ask you something gently. Have you noticed how often people describe you as intense when what they really mean is consistent? How often your clarity gets labeled as pressure simply because it doesn't waver? That's not something to fix, that's something to understand. You weren't holding them to a standard, you were holding yourself. And when someone isn't ready to hold themselves with the same honesty, your calm becomes confronting. Not because you confront them, but because you don't look away. There's a quiet dignity in that, Aries. One that doesn't chase explanations, one that doesn't beg to be chosen. You stayed true without trying to prove anything. And that's often when the running starts. Not as a rejection of you, but as an escape from the version of themselves they felt standing right next to you. Let that land. Because what they felt in that moment wasn't fear of losing you. It was fear of losing the excuses they've been leaning on for years. And once someone feels that, everything inside them begins to shift, whether they're ready or not. Aries, there's a quiet misunderstanding I want to gently clear tonight. When people say your energy felt too much, they're not talking about volume. They're talking about exposure. You didn't corner them with intensity. You didn't demand answers. You didn't rush the pace. What you did was simpler than that. You stayed consistent. Your words matched your actions. Your presence didn't fluctuate with mood or advantage. You showed up the same way on quiet days as you did when things mattered. And for someone who learned to survive by adjusting themselves to every room, that kind of steadiness can feel disorienting. Because Aries, you don't keep emotional doors half open. You don't say one thing and mean another. You don't disappear to gain leverage. When you care, it's visible. When you're unsure, it's honest. When you commit, you stand in it. That's not pressure, that's clarity. But clarity has a way of removing hiding places. I've seen this pattern so many times. People don't leave because they feel overwhelmed by love. They leave because love asks them to show up as their whole self. And not everyone has practiced that. Your energy didn't rush them. It slowed them down enough to hear their own hesitation. It asked questions without speaking. Questions like, am I living in alignment with what I say I want, or have I been postponing myself? You see, Aries, you move with a kind of inner permission. You don't wait for external validation to decide who you are, and when someone stands next to that, their own delays become louder. That's when your warmth gets misread as intensity. Your honesty gets labeled as too direct. Your presence gets called overwhelming, not because it is, but because it doesn't bend. There's a subtle courage in that, the courage to remain whole even when it would be easier to soften your edges to keep someone comfortable. You didn't negotiate your truth. You didn't shrink your needs. You didn't make yourself smaller to be easier to hold. And that's where the fear came from. Because staying with you would have required growth, not dramatic transformation, just consistent self-responsibility. And for someone who has been living on emotional autopilot, that feels like standing under a bright light after years of dimness. Let me ask you something, Aries. Have you ever noticed how the people who leave are often the ones who once said they admired your strength the most? Sometimes admiration turns into avoidance when it asks for reciprocity. Your energy didn't ask them to be perfect, it asked them to be present. And presence is a discipline. It asked you to stop outsourcing your power, to stop hiding behind timing, to stop waiting for a better version of yourself to arrive. You were already living that way, quietly, naturally. That's why being near you felt like a mirror they weren't ready to look into for very long. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's also nothing for you to fix. You weren't too much. You were too honest for a chapter they hadn't finished growing through yet. And sometimes, Aries, the bravest thing you can do is remain exactly who you are, while others decide whether they're ready to meet themselves. Aries. There's something tender beneath all of this that rarely gets spoken out loud. Somewhere inside them, two truths were living side by side, and they never learned how to let those truths meet. One part of them felt drawn to you in a way that surprised them. Not infatuation, not fantasy, but recognition that settled deep, the kind that lingers after the room goes quiet. And then there was the other part, the part that understood without words that staying would require an internal shift. Not a promise, not a performance, a real adjustment in how they relate to themselves. That kind of awareness doesn't always arrive gently. Sometimes it comes as restlessness, sometimes as doubt, sometimes as an urge to retreat before the ground beneath them changes shape. You see, Aries, wanting someone and being ready for what they invite into your life are two very different things. Desire can be spontaneous. Growth is deliberate. They felt both at once. They didn't lack. Feeling. They lacked practice sitting with feeling without escaping it. Your presence stirred questions they had learned to postpone. Questions about accountability, about emotional consistency, about whether they were living from choice or habit. And when those questions surfaced, there was no script for them to follow. So instead of naming the conflict, they internalized it. Instead of asking for time, they chose distance. Instead of admitting uncertainty, they framed it as confusion. Not because they wanted to hurt you, but because staying would have meant standing face to face with their own unfinished work. There's a particular kind of fear that arises when someone realizes a connection isn't just about chemistry. It's about character, about integrity over time, about whether your actions can keep pace with your intentions. You didn't pressure them into that realization. You simply existed in a way that made it unavoidable. And that's what makes this part so quiet. There was no argument to point to, no flaw to name. Just an internal reckoning they didn't yet know how to hold. Let me ask you something, Aries, softly. Have you ever noticed how some people mistake emotional depth for obligation because they have never learned how to stay present with themselves? That's often where the conflict lives. They wanted the warmth of connection without the responsibility of self-awareness. They wanted closeness without the invitation to evolve. And when those two desires collided, something had to give. So they chose the option that felt safest in the moment, distance. Not because the bond wasn't meaningful, but because meaning asked them to become more than they were prepared to be right then. That doesn't make them villains. It makes them human. And it doesn't diminish what you offered, it clarifies it. You brought sincerity into a space where ambiguity had been comfortable. You brought presence where avoidance had been familiar. And that contrast revealed a tension they hadn't resolved within themselves yet. There's a quiet strength in recognizing that not every departure is a rejection. Some are a reflection of an inner crossroads someone wasn't ready to stand at for very long. You didn't lose something real. You encountered someone in the middle of becoming and watched them turn away from the work before it had a chance to begin. And as painful as that can feel, Aries, it also means your way of loving is honest enough to expose truth. That matters, because connections that ask us to grow are never small, even when they end quietly. Aries, there's a moment I want to slow down with you, not to analyze it, but to understand it in a way that gives you your power back. Because what happened next wasn't dramatic. It wasn't strategic. It didn't come from a place of cruelty. It came from panic, not the loud kind, the quiet kind that moves faster than thought. They didn't sit with the discomfort long enough to name it. They didn't give themselves time to ask what they were actually afraid of. Instead, they reacted. And reactions are quick. They bypass courage. They bypass honesty. This is where the silence entered, not as a message, as a reflex. For some people, the moment something feels emotionally real, their nervous system reaches for the fastest exit, not because they don't care, but because caring removes their illusion of control. You see, Aries, staying would have required them to remain present while uncertainty moved through them. Running allowed them to feel relief without resolution. And relief can be seductive. It feels like safety for a brief moment, like breathing again, like getting out of a room that suddenly felt too honest. But there's a cost to that kind of relief. It doesn't last. What they chose wasn't a conclusion. It was avoidance dressed up as distance. I want to be clear about something here. This wasn't about you being abandoned because you weren't valued. It was about them choosing a familiar discomfort over an unfamiliar growth. They didn't have a script for how to say, "I feel scared by how much this matters." They didn't know how to say, "I'm not ready to meet myself yet." So they said nothing. Silence becomes the language of people who haven't learned how to speak vulnerability. And that silence can feel brutal on the receiving end, because it leaves you holding questions that were never yours to carry. You might have replayed conversations, checked your tone, wondered if you missed a signal. But Aries, the truth is, simpler and harder at the same time. They ran because staying would have required them to remain emotionally upright in a moment of fear. And they chose collapse instead. Not everyone knows how to stand when intimacy asks them to slow down. There's something important for you here. When someone disappears rather than speaking honestly, they reveal their capacity, not your worth. Your steadiness didn't push them away. It exposed the gap between who they were and who they would have needed to become to stay. Let me ask you something quietly. Have you ever noticed how some people confuse peace with absence because they've never learned how to find calm inside connection? That's the crossroads they reached, and they chose the path that required the least immediate courage. That choice doesn't define you, it clarifies you. You didn't lose someone who was ready to meet you. You encountered someone who reached their limit and stepped back instead of stepping forward. There is a quiet grief in that, and there is also relief, even if it hasn't fully arrived yet. Because the kind of love you offer doesn't survive on avoidance. It asks for presence, for honesty, for the willingness to stay when things feel real. And if someone cannot do that, their leaving becomes information, not about what you lacked, but about what they could not yet hold. Let that settle. Because what follows a moment like this is rarely immediate clarity. It's a slower understanding that unfolds when the noise fades and the truth has space to breathe. Aries, time as a way of changing the angle of the light. when you're no longer woven into someone's everyday rhythm, when your voice isn't the first thing they hear in the morning or the quiet presence at the end of a long day, something interesting happens. The noise settles, and from that distance, they begin to notice what they missed while they were still inside the moment. Not drama, not demands, not chaos. What becomes clear instead is how steady you actually were. You didn't pull them into emotional storms. You didn't create urgency to feel important. You didn't build connection through tension. You moved through your days with structure, with intention, with a calm sense of direction that didn't need to be announced. That kind of steadiness can be easy to overlook when someone is distracted by their own inner turbulence. But once you're no longer there to absorb it, the contrast becomes unmistakable. They see now that you weren't complicated. You were consistent. You weren't asking to be rescued or reassured. You were already standing on your own ground. And that ground didn't shift depending on their mood. Aries, there's a quiet strength in someone who doesn't need to be reactive to feel alive. Someone who knows when to speak and when to let silence do the work. Someone who continues forward without announcing their progress. That's what becomes visible from afar. They begin to notice how you didn't chase resolution, how you didn't try to manage their emotions, how you allowed space without turning it into punishment. You simply lived. And in living, you showed something many people don't encounter often. A version of strength that isn't loud, a confidence that doesn't perform, a presence that doesn't collapse when attention moves away. That realization arrives slowly, often at night. In the quiet moments when distraction runs out, it shows up when they compare new connections to the memory of your groundedness, when they realize how rare it is to feel calm without feeling bored, how uncommon it is to be seen without being interrogated. From that distance, your restraint reads differently. What once felt uneventful now feels safe. What once felt understated now feels mature. Let me ask you something gently, Aries. Have you ever noticed how true stability only becomes visible after it's no longer there to lean on? That's part of this unfolding. They see now that you weren't withholding emotion. You were regulating it. You weren't detached. You were self-contained. And that's a kind of strength that doesn't ask for recognition. It just exists. This doesn't mean they suddenly understand everything. Awareness often comes in pieces, but one piece tends to land clearly. You didn't make life heavier. You made it more balanced. That balance becomes obvious when it's gone. And while they may still be sorting through what that means for them, there's something important for you to hold. Your calm wasn't accidental. It was cultivated. You built it through self-respect, through boundaries that didn't need to be explained, through choosing progress over performance. And whether or not they fully articulate it, that's what they see now. Not from closeness, but from the clarity that only distance can provide. Sometimes, Aries, the most powerful thing about you isn't what you say or do. It's the way you continue forward without needing anyone else to catch up. Aries, there's a quieter chapter that follows distance, and it doesn't announce itself the way heartbreak does. It arrives softly, often at night, when the day has used up its distractions and the room finally goes still. That's when memory stops being dramatic and starts being honest. They don't replay arguments because there weren't many. They don't fixate on conflict because nothing ever exploded. What comes back instead are the small, ordinary moments they barely noticed at the time. The way your presence lowered the volume in the room. The way conversations didn't need to be steered or performed. The feeling of being allowed to exhale without explanation. Regret doesn't come in waves for them. It settles in like background noise. It hums while they brush their teeth. It shows up when they reach for their phone and realize there's no reason to check anymore. It lingers when they lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering why peace felt unfamiliar when it was right in front of them. This isn't the kind of regret that asks for a second chance. It's the kind that asks better questions. What did I walk away from without understanding it? Why did stability feel dull when it was actually grounding? Why did I confuse calm with emptiness? Because Aries, regret doesn't begin with loss. It begins with comparison. They meet people who feel safe on the surface, predictable, agreeable, emotionally available in theory. But something is missing. There's no depth to lean into. No quiet strength underneath the words. No sense of being held without being managed. That's when your absence becomes loud. Not because you were exciting, but because you were real. You didn't fill space with constant reassurance. You didn't manufacture closeness. You didn't ask to be needed. You offered something subtler. A sense of balance that didn't require effort to maintain. And that's what they didn't know how to value until it was gone. Regret like this isn't cinematic, it's cumulative. It grows when they realize how rare it is to feel both calm and engaged, when they understand that intensity isn't the same as intimacy, when they notice how exhausting it is to keep starting over with people who never really see them. Let me ask you something gently, Aries. Have you ever noticed how some people only recognize depth after spending time in shallow waters? That's where they are now. This phase isn't about punishment, it's about awareness arriving late. They aren't haunted by what you did. They're haunted by what they didn't step into. And here's the part I want you to hear clearly. Their regret doesn't mean you should wait. It doesn't mean you missed something. It means your way of being left an imprint. You didn't teach them through speeches. You taught them through consistency. Through the way you showed up without conditions. Through the way you didn't collapse when things went quiet. Through the way you continued living instead of lingering. That kind of presence becomes a reference point, one they didn't know they were making at the time. So if you ever find yourself wondering whether what you offered mattered, remember this. Some lessons don't register when they're happening. They register later, in stillness, when comparison sharpens clarity. Their regret is quiet, but it's real. And it doesn't pull you backward. It simply confirms that the calm you brought into the room was never ordinary. It was just ahead of where they were ready to live. Aries, there's a quiet shift that happens when your life keeps moving forward, even after someone has stepped out of it. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't come with announcements or closure speeches. It shows up in the way your days reorganize themselves without asking permission. You wake up. You handle what's in front of you. You keep your promises to yourself. And somewhere along the way, access changes. Not because you blocked a number, not because you hardened your heart, but because your inner world no longer revolves around explaining yourself. This is what people rarely understand from the outside. Growth doesn't slam doors, it changes the locks by living differently. You didn't leave with resentment trailing behind you. You didn't make your absence a statement. You simply stopped pausing your life at the edge of someone else's readiness. That's an Aries truth most people don't talk about. When you decide to move forward, you don't do it halfway. You don't linger in maybes. You don't orbit what's already shown you its limits. You step into the next version of yourself quietly. And once you're there, some people can't find you anymore. Not because you disappeared, but because the version of you they knew no longer exists in the same place. There's a subtle dignity in that. You didn't punish them with silence. You didn't demand remorse. You didn't wait for understanding to arrive. You chose alignment instead. And alignment doesn't negotiate with unfinished business. Have you noticed how some people can only reach you when you're emotionally available to confusion? When you're open to revisiting the same questions? When you're willing to shrink your forward motion to make space for hesitation? That doorway closes naturally when self-respect takes the lead. Your boundaries didn't harden, they clarified. They became less about protection and more about direction. You began to live from a place that didn't require revisiting old dynamics to feel complete. Your energy stopped circulating around what left and started investing in what was forming. From the outside, it might look like distance. From the inside, it feels like coherence. That's why reaching you now feels different to them. It's not rejection they sense. It's momentum. You're not standing where they left you. You're not holding space for explanations that came too late. You're not waiting for insight to catch up with action. You kept going. And here's the part I want you to really take in. This isn't about winning. It's not about proving anything. It's not even about being chosen. It's about choosing yourself without needing a witness. That kind of maturity becomes a boundary all on its own. It doesn't need enforcement. It doesn't need defense. It simply exists. Let me ask you something softly, Aries. Have you ever noticed how peace becomes unreachable to those who only look for access after clarity is already formed? That's what's happening here. You didn't close the door with anger. You walked through a new one with intention. And anyone who didn't pass the earlier tests wasn't meant to follow you into this chapter, not as punishment, but as truth. You don't need to explain your growth. You don't need to justify your distance. You don't need to reopen what has already resolved itself through action. Your life is speaking for you now. And that, Aries, is what makes you unreachable in the healthiest way possible. Aries, there's a moment that doesn't feel like closure at first. It feels like space, not the empty kind, the kind that breathes. After everything quieted, after the noise stopped asking you to look back, something inside you recalibrated. Your days began to arrange themselves around what was real for you now, not around what could have been, not around explanations that never arrived. And that's where the ending begins to change its shape. You didn't lose a person. You outgrew a dynamic that required you to keep translating yourself. You stepped out of a connection that needed you smaller than you actually are. That realization doesn't land with fireworks. It lands with steadiness. You notice it in how your body feels when you wake up, in how decisions come with less second guessing, in how your energy no longer gets pulled into places that feel unresolved. There's a quiet relief in not having to carry someone else's readiness on your shoulders. This is the part people don't talk about enough. The part where the story stops being about what happened to you and starts being about who you are becoming. You begin to recognize how much of yourself you were already holding together, how much emotional labor you were doing silently, how often you were adjusting your pace to make room for uncertainty that wasn't yours. And then something shifts. You don't harden, you don't close off. You simply stop volunteering to be misunderstood. That's growth for an Aries, not rushing ahead, not burning bridges, just choosing clarity over repetition. Ahead of you isn't a perfect connection, it's an honest one. One that doesn't need you to explain your instincts. One that doesn't interpret your consistency as pressure. One that meets your presence with presence. You won't need to announce this change. People will feel it. They'll sense how you listen without overgiving, how you engage without chasing, how you remain warm without abandoning your center. Let me ask you something gently. What if the connection you've been preparing for isn't waiting for you to soften, but to arrive exactly as you are? There's a kind of love that doesn't test your endurance. It doesn't ask you to prove your worth through patience. It doesn't mistake your independence for distance. It recognizes your fire as direction, your honesty as safety, your calm as depth. And you don't have to look far ahead to imagine it. You can feel it in the way your life is already opening, in the opportunities that don't require convincing, in the conversations that flow without effort, in the sense that you no longer need to brace yourself before being yourself. That's not coincidence. That's alignment beginning to take shape. The story started with them, but it ends with you standing in your own truth, without apology, without hesitation, without shrinking. You didn't lose something meaningful. You made space for something mature. And as this chapter settles, let this land softly. If they ran, Aries, it wasn't because you were too much. It was because you were finally real. And real always moves forward. Aries, as this story softens into stillness, let me ask you something. What if the moment they ran was also the moment your life quietly chose you back? Because here's a small thing I've noticed, and it's easy to miss unless you're listening closely. When something real leaves your path, your body often relaxes before your mind understands why. You may have felt it, that subtle exhale, that unexpected calm, not happiness yet, just space. And in that space, there's an invitation. Tonight, before you sleep, place one hand on your chest. No affirmations, no fixing. Just notice what feels steady inside you now that didn't feel steady before. That's not loss. That's integration. There's no need to rush meaning out of this chapter. Some truths prefer silence. They settle when we stop interrogating them. So if you're hearing this late, in a quiet room, with the world turned down low, know this. You didn't fall behind. You didn't miss your moment. You aligned with it, and maybe the next connection won't announce itself loudly. Maybe it won't arrive with fireworks or urgency. Maybe it will feel familiar in a new way, like recognition without effort. I'll leave you with this thought, and you can carry it with you if it fits. Sometimes the real reason someone runs is because staying would have required them to meet the version of you who no longer asks to be chosen. If this resonated, leave a quiet comment below. Just one word is enough. And if you want to stay connected to this space, subscribe so you don't miss what unfolds next. Trust yourself, Aries. The journey doesn't end here. It simply continues. And the next message is already forming.